Good evening, everyone. My name is Marilyn O'Connell, and I'm president of the board of the Vilna Shul Boston Center for Jewish Culture. Thank you so much for joining us tonight from all over the country. I hope wherever you are all safe and warm. We are thrilled to partner tonight with the ADL for this important discussion. From the photos, you saw that we are in a historic building. The Vilna Shul was the association was started in 1888 by immigrants to Boston from Vilnius, Russia. It was then Russia, now Lithuania. And in 1919, they finally built a synagogue building, and it was really the center of the community in that area. About a year ago, we were just absolutely thrilled to have reopened after a historic restoration, $4 million restoration. And we were just so excited that the building was doing what it was we hoped it would do, which would be welcome people for important discussions. And then alas, COVID hit. So we pivoted to our virtual Vilna platform, and we've been staying relevant and been welcoming everybody to the Vilna virtually. So thank you all for being with us. We hope that we will be able to reopen soon, but in the meantime, we're seeing you all here, and we hope that when it is safe and everyone is comfortable to join us on Beacon Hill, that you will come in. And we'll also be doing a hybrid version of our events so that wherever you are, you can still join us for these important discussions. So I'd like to introduce Rabbi Tiferet Berenbaum, who will lead us in our celebration of the end of the week. We're looking forward to the coming week. And I just want to add that this week is very special for the Vilna because we have a new executive director, Dalit Ballenhorn, who is starting this week. And so we welcome Dalit. We're all super excited to have you join our Vilna family. So Rabbi Berenbaum, please welcome him.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, fantastic. Shavua Tov, everyone. So Shabbat, the Sabbath, is one of the greatest gifts that I believe the Jewish people have to offer the world. And another one is our idea of teshuvah and tikkun, which hopefully we'll get to talk about later. But Shabbat is a gift to anyone who would accept it. Rabbi Dr. Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote in his work entitled "The Sabbath" to set one day a week for freedom, a day on which we would not use the instruments which have been so easily turned into weapons of destruction, a day for being with ourselves, a day of detachment from the vulgar, of independence, of external obligations, a day on which we stop worshiping the idols of technical civilization, a day on which we use no money, a day of armistice in the economic struggle with our fellow men and the forces of nature. Is there any institution that holds out a greater hope for humanity's progress than the Sabbath? It's just a delight to enjoy a day outside of time. But unfortunately, Shabbat cannot last forever because we have work to do. The mitzvah of Shabbat comes attached to the mitzvah of working 6 days a week. And so with our Havdalah ceremony, we re-enter the week of work and purpose. Havdalah is our bittersweet re-entry into this world. We pick the mantle back up and begin the holy service once again. We will transform time from Kodesh L'chol, from Shabbat back into the week with our grape juice. We will refresh our spirit and breathe one last breath of the sweetness of Shabbat with our spices, our besamim. And we will glimpse the light of the first day of creation, the organuz, that lights the way for us to the messianic times as we do this work and we work towards that time when we'll all be connected in one loving whole. Light our fire. Yai dai da 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 dai dai yai dai da 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 dai dai yai da 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 yai dai dai yai dai yai dai dai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri Hagafen borei peri hagafen. Ay dai da 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 dai ay dai da 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 dai ay da 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 ya da da ya da da Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei minei vesamim borei minei vesamim ay dai da 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 dai ay ay da 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 dai ay dai 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 ay dai 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei meorei ha'esh borei meorei ha'esh ay dai da 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 dai dai ay dai da 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 dai dai Yai dai 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 yai yai dai yai dai dai yai dai dai Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol ben or lechoshech Ben Adam Livriot, Ben Yom Hashvi'i, L'Sheshet Yemei HaMaseh, Baruch Atah Adonai, Hamavdil Ben Kodesh Lechol. Chaim. As we extinguish the light, and we become the light for the coming week. Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov. A good week, a week of peace. May gladness reign and joy increase. Shavua tov. So I'm now going to pass it to Robert Treston, ADL New England's Regional Director and Vice President of ADL's Western Division.
Thank you, Rabbi Berenbaum, for helping us welcome the week on such a hopeful note. And I want to welcome everyone who's joining us today, this evening. We have a huge crowd, and I know that if we were in person at San Francisco State University or Dartmouth College or Temple Beth Zion in Brookline, Massachusetts, I don't think we would have enough seats in those spaces for everyone that's joining us tonight. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to thank the Vilna Shul for partnering with us on this program. We're so glad to be working with you to have this important and really timely conversation for our community. And personally, I just can't wait to get back into the Vilna Shul space. So for anyone who's joining us tonight, who's never been there, it is a special historic and sacred space in Boston, and I'm looking forward to getting back there. Tonight, we will explore the myths and realities about Jewish participation in the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s, and how it can inform our participation in the fight for racial justice today. And I hope that we all take what we learned tonight and find meaningful ways to engage in our communities. And that also means meaningful discussions in our own circles, our friends, our families, and at the dinner tables and workplaces where we spend so much time. This work is as urgent today as it was then. We're pleased to have with us tonight 3 thought leaders who are joining us to share their expertise on historical and current Jewish engagement in racial justice work, and share with us on how to build more inclusive Jewish communities today. We've reserved time at the end of the program for questions from the audience and participants. So you should feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box in the Zoom screen, and we will do our best to get to as many of them as possible towards the end of the program. I'm just going to briefly introduce our guests, which we have like a real all-star panel tonight of expertise, knowledge, and experience. We will put a link in the chat so that people can go into or read sort of more detailed bios and backgrounds on everyone who's participating. Rabbi Tiferet Berenbaum, who you all met just a few moments ago, is the rabbi of Congregational Learning and Programming at Temple Beth Zion in Brookline, Massachusetts. She received a rabbinic ordination and a master's in Jewish education from Hebrew College in 2013. She is originally from Brookline and has served congregations in Milwaukee, Wisconsin and Mount Holly, New Jersey before returning home to TBZ, which is a place where I also spend some time. And just I'm grateful that she is part of our community, and I love being in the synagogue when she's on the bima. Professor Marc Dollinger holds the Richard and Rhoda Goldman Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies and Social Responsibility at San Francisco State University. Professor Dollinger is author of 4 scholarly books in American Jewish history, most recently Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. Professor Susannah Heschel is the Eli M. Black Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Jewish Studies Program at Dartmouth College. She's also the author of Abraham Geiger and the Jewish Jesus, The Aryan Jesus, Christian Theologies and the Bible in Nazi Germany, amongst various other works. Susannah is also the daughter of the late Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama on March 21st, 1965. Welcome. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Heschel, who will be sharing her insights as well as moderating this conversation.
Thank you so much, Robert Treston, and it's wonderful to be with the Vilna Shul and also with the Anti-Defamation League. And I'm so glad that we've partnered this evening. And it's wonderful to be with my old friend, Marc Dollinger, and my new friend, Tiferet Berenbaum, for this discussion that I'm going to moderate and join also. So I want to begin perhaps with Marc and just ask you if you would introduce to everyone something about yourself and what brought you to write a book called Black Power, Jewish Politics, a book that many of us have read with great benefit. It's a very important book. Those of you who have not yet read it, I urge you to do so. And it's a book that focuses, well, I'll let you talk about your book. I'm not going to summarize it in front of you. But how did you come to write it? What was it that motivated you?
Thanks so much, Professor. Shavua Tov, and Rabbi, thank you so much for the beautiful Havdalah as well. Great to be here. So my research, of course, started in graduate school, and my doctoral advisor made kind of a snide comment to me one day. She said, you know, graduate students' first books, it's a journey in self-discovery. And I objected, right? Because I wasn't like all the other ones. And she said, well, what's your dissertation on? I said, American Jewish liberalism. And she just stared at me, right? So I've been interested in Jews and liberalism, you know, since growing up in the 70s in LA. And my first book really went from the 30s to the 70s. And I was really intrigued by the 60s. And I decided what I wanted to do was dive deeper, do sort of an entire book on what was just one chapter of the dissertation. And the more I went into the archives, the more I realized that the stories I was told growing up in religious school especially didn't really match the history that I was reading from the primary sources. So the Black Power book was really a chance to challenge not only history and historiography, that is the way academic historians view the past, but also historical memory. And if I could throw one other thing into the introduction, because I think it's going to come into play with the three of us tonight. I was trained in graduate school that academic historians were supposed to be detached, third person, analytic, critical, remove yourself from the narrative, and one should be able to write any history of any place at any time, regardless, right? If you do a good job, you do a good job. Except when you write about Jews, race, and racism, it immediately blends into the current moment and to folks' ideas for the future. And sort of there's an assumption of activism, right? And wanting to bring change. So I'm excited to be here, to be with you and to be with Rabbi Berenbaum, and to sort of blur the boundaries between rabbi, academic, activist around racial justice.
Thank you. I would add that there's also an element of activism in the scholarship written by women in women's studies and feminist theory. So we're with you, Marc. And now I want to turn to Tiferet Berenbaum. I have to tell you that I also was a member of TVZ when we used to live in Brookline, and it's a wonderful congregation, and it's great that you're there. And I also have to tell you that I have still a lingering rabbi envy, because I wanted to go to rabbinical school, but at that time, the conservative movement was not accepting women. And of course, by now, women are not a rarity in the rabbinate, and that's wonderful. But I would imagine that as a Black woman, you are still, at this moment anyway, a bit of a rarity. And I wonder if you might like to speak about what brought you to the rabbinate, and also, as one feminist to another, what kinds of problems you might have encountered in rabbinical school and as a congregational rabbi, and what you think we need to address for the future generations.
Okay, how long do I have? Well, I should start by saying it's never too late to go to rabbinical school. They're all still open. Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction and the questions. So what brought me to the rabbinate? Really and simply, there's a love of Judaism, really a love of Jewish culture, of Jewish languages, Jewish thought systems. And right off the bat, I discovered that there are Judaisms, plural, and that our tradition is so diverse and varied. And in college, I majored in I majored in Jewish studies. My focus was Sephardic culture. So I learned Ladino alongside Yiddish culture. I learned about Ethiopian Jewry. I learned about Latin American Jewry and the role of Latin American countries as Jews were fleeing from the Holocaust and the cultures that grew up alongside that. So I went into the rabbinate because I loved all of these things. And, I was spending time with people who weren't learning any of these things, who didn't see the dynamic nature of Judaism because they only saw it their way. And they only saw it from their perspective in their neighborhood. I grew up in Brookline, so, it's pretty homogeneous. And so I said, yeah, I'm going to go to rabbinical school. I'm going to learn all of this. I'm going to just imbibe our tradition and find ways to give it back to people so that they can take it and make it their own and do that and own it. And, when I went to rabbinical school, I was, my first year, I was the only person of color in my class. I was the only woman in my class. So it was quite intimidating, and there were a lot of male rabbis on faculty. We certainly had some amazing women on faculty, but mostly male. So I didn't feel empowered to speak up. I didn't feel empowered to ask questions that were floating around in my mind. And now having come a little further in life and being able to reflect, I never knew what was holding me back. Was it that I was a Black person? Was it that I was a woman? And Professor Dollinger was, just saying how in academia we learn that we need to be objective and And now I'm working on my doctoral studies, and it's the complete opposite message. I mean, we're spending semesters diving into our socio-cultural perspectives and really trying to understand who we are and the standpoints that we are writing from. So I'm enjoying getting to reflect on these things. Going into the rabbinate, like leaving rabbinical school, one of the things I wish I would have had was a conversation with someone about what does it mean to be a Black woman serving a white congregation. And now I'm happy to have that conversation with the rabbis of color who are coming up nowadays, thank God. But that, there was no one to have that conversation with me, really. And so it was just really fascinating to be a woman and a Black person, both things that, I was coming behind two men who had become emeritus rabbis. So very different experiences and very different welcoming. And, what do I think we need to do? I think everyone needs to work on themselves. I've discovered in life that we can't change anyone. Like, the only person that any of us has the power to change is ourselves, and how we react to things, how we understand things. So questioning what we know, how we know, the messages that we're receiving, it's like the foundation of our tradition as we're moving towards Passover and thinking about, the 4 questions, and the Talmud says everything that we do for the Seder is for the sake of people asking questions, especially our children. So taking that up and asking those questions instead of responding to things from a place of defensiveness, because even investigating that defensiveness is asking a question and is doing the work that I believe is important for us to be doing today.
Well, it sounds like some of your experiences in rabbinical school are similar to mine in graduate school, and I really want to hear about your dissertation topic, so we have to talk about that sometime. But I actually would imagine that you're not the only person you can change. I'm pretty sure that the people who listen to you in the synagogue are also changing as a result, and I'm glad about that. And I guess, we're here to talk about Jews and race. And usually the first thing that happens when this conversation begins, at least in my experience, is that people talk about my father and Dr. King and the Selma March or some other aspect of the relationship. As it happens, I'm talking to you from my living room, and I have a lot of family photos. And one of them that's on this table on my piano here is this picture, which was taken of my father and Dr. King the very last time that we were all together at a hotel in the Catskills, the Concord Hotel, some people might remember nostalgically. But I'm just wondering if both of you, and either one of you could go first, might talk about how the memory of my father's relationship with Dr. King has functioned in terms of the discussions among Jews about racism in recent years in particular. Marc, do you want to say something about that? I know that we also want to talk about your book and how you address, in a sense, what came next, the post-Selma relationship. But why don't you say something about these kinds of photos?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, if I could bring the question to you first, because it's been a personal and professional interest and curiosity around the notion of snapshots and historical memory, right? So there's a few very famous photographs of your father and Dr. King, and in sort of our collective memory of the moment, the Selma March photo is often, held. And from that, we sort of come to lots of conclusions about what the movement was. In terms of, as a daughter and now as a scholar yourself and as one who's sort of navigating these worlds together, how do you see that snapshot when it was taken? How do you see the snapshot now? And of course, afterwards, I'd love to offer some of my thoughts, but I would really love to hear how you relate to memory as against the movement and today.
Well, first of all, in those days, in the 60s, my father's relationship with Dr. King, his involvement in the civil rights movement, was not something that was, shall we say, appreciated by his colleagues at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And it was really only much later, after my father died, maybe in the 1980s, that Jews began to say to me that they admire my father for having been involved in the civil rights movement. And that began very gradually. So this is a recent phenomenon, first of all. But I would say what's most meaningful to me is that whenever I meet someone from the civil rights days, people who knew my father, Andrew Young or John Lewis or C.T. Vivian, James Lawson, so many, they're so grateful. They express gratitude for my father. And what I learned from that is something very important, the lesson of expressing gratitude that I don't hear from anyone from other circles of my father's life, really from the civil rights. And I think it's also something that goes along with the nonviolence, because nonviolence in those days meant not simply that if someone hits you, you don't hit back. It meant a kind of training of the mind and the spirit, the heart and the soul for months and months to become a different kind of person. And when I meet someone from the civil rights movement, I also sense that this is a special person. Reverend Vivian, who just died a few months ago, was really a holy human being. Something holy about him. So my memory of that era is one thing, but the chance to still be with those civil rights leaders and hear them express gratitude, that's an important religious lesson for me. And I think the civil rights movement also was an ecumenical movement, and that's important. And by the way, the Alabama State Police took thousands and thousands of photographs covertly that are held in a museum in Selma, and I urge everyone to go and have a look. But you know, the next thing that people will always say to me is, what happened to the alliance? So Mark, why don't you address that?
All right, thank you.
It really annoys me, I have to say.
Yeah. So, and if I can, I'm gonna go from that picture, because you reached out to me after the book came out, and I appreciated that. And I'll just share with the 400 people watching today, I was really nervous when I saw your name on the email, because some people misread my thesis to be a repudiation of their relationship and the image. And that is that in the moment, those Jews who went south to fight for civil rights were, in my mind, heroes, because they were risking power, privilege, and in some cases their lives to benefit other people. And most American Jews were not living that particular life. Most were in the North, in the suburbs, engaged in lifestyles which were fully segregated, and were playing off this idealized notion of what it was to be a white Jew in America, and then taking that photograph of your father as if it applied to each of us, and every one of us across the country, and then going from there. So in my research, I discovered actually that the mostly white, male, middle-aged national leaders of Jewish organizations understood the limits of white Jewish liberal allyship. They understood there needed to be more Black autonomy. And they all but predicted the demise of this alliance, so that when it came, in their minds and in the research, it was the next positive step forward for racial equity, except historical memory and journalism sort of blamed the Blacks, right, for having ruined things through Black power and Black militancy and anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And the whole story just flipped, right? So in my research in Black power, I note not only did they know about it in the 50s and early 60s, not only were they not as alarmed by the breakup as we seem to be now, but that Jewish leaders found in Black Power militancy an opportunity for Jews to express their own ethnic identities in a more public way.
Yes, and I think that you make that point very clear in your book, and it's an important one, that the Black Power movement also inspired Jews, and Black studies inspired Jewish studies, for example, at universities. And Tiferet, maybe I can turn to you and ask you, do you have ideas and suggestions? People always wanted to know, what can I do now? Or what should the Jewish community do now? Our organizations or our teachers, our rabbis? What do you think?
Yeah, do something. You know, that's my first piece of advice. And I'm so glad you started off this conversation, because when I am asked to speak places, and I'm, telling this message of do something, someone will inevitably say, but Heschel. And it's like, yes, that's what he did. And that was 50 plus years ago. What have you done? How have you put yourself on the line, inconvenienced yourself, made yourself uncomfortable, emulated, not just appreciated, right? What he did, right? And, to really take that story, the story of civil rights in America, the story of the treatment of Black-skinned, brown-skinned people in this country, and to make it one's own, to see how it is also the Jewish story, right? So like our Torah is telling us that we can't go back to Mitzrayim. This is how we treat Gerim, because we understand this. We have to make these causes our own. All the more so because when it comes to especially Jews of color, it's not the Black community and the Jewish community. Right? Like I belong to both communities, right? So where does that line? Where do we draw that line? And for me, it was very, very complicated back in, gosh, it's still complicated, but like back in 2014 when Black Lives Matter came out, and there was so much police violence, there still is so much police violence, but when it really became much more visible, and that's the key. It's now very visible. How did I exist in spaces, in predominantly white Jewish spaces, that were feeling hurt by some of the words that were coming out of the technically the Movement for Black Lives platform, which has since been amended. But how do we understand this story as our own, as Jews, that this is the Jewish story, and so we can't just stand idly by. We have to see that our neighbors, our brothers, our sisters are dying. So what do we do? I always start with questions, and asking the questions of who's benefiting? Why is this making me uncomfortable? Who is saying this? Is there truth in this? Where is this coming from? And being non-judgmental about those questions is so important, because then, we become defensive. Really just asking the questions, and having honest conversations, and being ready to be uncomfortable. And I think that's so important, because we've lived lives of comfort for a long time, myself included, right? Like I grew up in Brookline. I was raised on white supremacy like most of us, right? And so it's time for uncomfortable conversations and uncomfortable truths.
I appreciate that very much, what you just said. And maybe I should also point out that my father was involved with the movement to free Soviet Jewry. And I remember when he gave his first lecture on that topic, my mother was reading his speech, reading his speech ahead of time and telling him, this is too strong, you have to tone it down, people are going to get mad. And indeed they did. They got very angry and attacked him. Jews should be quiet, shush, still. You don't upset the government. Don't talk about this, Soviet Jews. But you had mentioned to me privately that what if the Jewish community organized an effort, as we did to free Soviet Jews, to do something about racism in this country, to address systemic racism? And I think that's a great question and a great idea, a great suggestion. One of the things that I've learned from the Anti-Defamation League is that you can sit down and talk to people who may differ with you. You don't walk away. And there may be, in fact, in my own experience, I love to daven in a Hasidic shtibel, but I don't like the way women have to sit upstairs, hidden away. What can I do? We all have to, somehow find some common ground. So I agree. The Black Lives Matter platform came out and people got upset about one paragraph in the middle of 40,000. And what do? You sit and talk to people and work it out. But let me ask you both, we're talking a lot these days about systemic racism and the way racism is described in terms of our economy, our politics, our public policy, that in fact, racism is so severe that politicians would rather deny everyone, including white people, the right to access to healthcare. They would rather deny it to everyone than to allow Black people to have that access, for example. And there was something in the New York Times about that just today, but it's something that's known to scholars. I wonder if we could talk not only about systemic racism, but also in a more personal, human, subjective way, what that means. What does it mean? And on a human level, we're talking about Black people who are murdered on the street, men, women, and children, for being Black by the police, the state representing the state, wearing a badge, and how that's given rise to a literature of Afro-pessimism. I think of Frank Wilderson, who's out in California with you, Mark, or Tendai Sithole, a South African philosopher, wrote an important book called The Black Register. But let's think about the human for a moment. What is the human impact of the racism and the generations, one after another, who inherit that trauma? Would either of you like to say something about addressing that? And perhaps if there are Jewish teachings that we can offer that might address the trauma for one thing, but also address what we need to do in terms of changing our society, in terms of reparations, for example.
Well, I'll jump in and start. As I said before, I think that one of the greatest gifts that the Jewish community, that Judaism, right, singularly has to offer the world is the process of teshuvah, and within that, the idea of tikkun. Teshuvah being a correctiveness, a return to the path, to what is, and tikkun being repair. Right. So when we think about reparations, it is tikkun olam. It is fixing and bringing light to a very, very dark place in our country's, I was going to say history, but in our country's present. And the process of teshuvah starts with recognizing the wrongs and seeing the wrongs, and it's so important to be able to see, to be able to acknowledge. And that's, goes back to what I was saying about the questions. That's where the questioning comes in, right? It wasn't until Moses stopped to ask a question, why is this bush not being consumed, that God revealed God's self to Moses, right? Moses was able to look and ask the question. And that's what we need to do, is look it in the face, notice it, and ask the questions. And please God, then the truth will reveal itself to us as we seek to discover it. And then the next step is acknowledging that we've done something wrong. And that's where people bristle, because it's not an issue of guilt, right? It's something, a wrong has happened. Someone at a talk said, well, my ancestors came here after slavery, so I'm not responsible for this. And I said, look, my ancestors came here during slavery and weren't responsible for what happened to the native peoples. But still, I take that on, right? I bear that responsibility as an American, right? So when we come to America and we put on the mantle of Americanism, we also bear America's sins and are responsible, or chayav. And then finding a way to do tikkun, finding a way to fix the problem. And I don't, and again, people bristle at the word reparations because I think people feel like I'm going to lose something immediately, something, and that's, you know, the fear of I'm not going to have enough, I'm going to be at a loss. But reparations can, I'm going to say, asking the question, what could reparations look like, is the beginning of the conversation, right? And not making assumptions that are frightening. And it could look like a lot of things. So starting out and doing this process will bring us back, is a path of teshuvah, of returning us to the American ideal. Unfortunately, we never had that. This country was not based on that. But we can return to the ideal, to the country that people thought we had, or some still think we have. We can get there.
I appreciate your optimism. That's great. And I would just say it's interesting what you said, because in Germany, for instance, there are many people who came to live in Germany after World War II, and yet they're taught in school. You have responsibility for the crimes of Germany during the war. You also have responsibility for the Holocaust and for the anti-Semitism of Germany, even if you arrived already only in the 60s, of course. So I feel the same way you do about this. And it's also very clear that racism costs this country a lot of money. This country would be much better off economically, all of us financially, if we address systemic racism. And social scientists have, of course, made that clear. I guess with your optimism, I want to turn to Marc and ask you something about optimism. I have to say that the photograph of my father at Selma is sometimes used by people, as both of you have pointed out, as the kind of, look, we were there. All right. And I always feel, I'm not sure, and I can hear my father saying this honestly. My father would be saying, it's not the photograph, it's what you do with it. And the photograph has to be a challenge. Don't sit back with that photograph and say, look what we did. We look at that photograph and say, what should I do? And I wonder, Marc, how you evaluate the decades since 1965, let's say. Are you optimistic for the future? Do you think things are getting better or worse? I have days when I'm deeply pessimistic about this country, but what do you think?
Yeah, thank you. And if I can sort of answer that by also talking about your original question and the rabbi's response. And this is really my own personal learning right now, certainly since the murder of George Floyd and even with feedback on the Black Power book. I knew a lot about white privilege, and I think sort of white Jewish liberals, you know, that's our first step, is understanding the privilege that comes along. Your question and the rabbi's response is about the costs of whiteness. And this is something that I've underestimated and that I'm learning more about, which is to say, the extent to which white American Jews, in order to achieve the American dream, and did get lots of great stuff, you know, in terms of all the stuff we got, have also sacrificed ourselves, perhaps, our souls, our Judaism, and the rest of it. So, you know, when your father and Dr. King were in struggle, there was legal inequality. And in 1964, when the Civil Rights Act passed, and 65 with the Voting Rights Act, you know, there was a sense of optimism, you know, that the job, you know, we've done it, except, you know, that you know, most white Jewish liberals didn't understand that legal equality doesn't bring real equality. This is systemic. So I'll give you sort of, I'm optimistic, but here's the bad news, the good news, right? The bad news and the optimism is that white supremacists, right, those who seek to bring harm, are bringing harm to white Jews and bringing harm to Blacks, because both groups, anti-Semitism and racism, are equal, you know, horribly. And the last 5 years, we've seen the worst cases of anti-Semitic violence in US history. So in terms of coming up with a partnership that's going to be more equitable and a greater sense of two peoples, or in many cases, one people, like coming together, we have that now. And I think there's more humility now, which helps. And then the second is social media. You know, your father and Dr. King were charismatic leaders who could be focal points to organize and bring change. Now we have protests in the streets, seemingly spontaneous, without leadership among all ages and all other sorts of identity categories. So I have to hope, at least, that we're really in a better place now than we were in the 50s and 60s, because those of us in white America who are on our learning journeys are in a place we weren't, 50 or 60 years ago. And folks are literally taking to the streets in visualizations that I don't think we've seen before.
Yes, that's very true. And I think, in the late 60s and for quite a while, actually, there were debates about affirmative action. And that was something that seemed to split us within the Jewish world and between the Jewish world and the Black community, Black leaders. And nowadays, it seems to be much more around Israel, that there are splits and a problem in forging alliances. I would just say that we once had a speaker at Dartmouth, a Jewish man who was the president of a college, and he talked about affirmative action as being bad for the Jews. And I raised my hand and I said, well, I'm a Jew and I'm a woman. And as a woman, affirmative action is great for me. It really is helping my career. So why should we be opposed to it as Jews? I'm also a Jew and a woman. And I feel the same way, of course, about Black Jews. And I would like Jewish organizations to be as loud and outspoken about race and about sexism as they are about certain other issues in the Jewish community, and recognize this. But let's talk for a moment about Israel. And I wonder if either of you have ever been in the situation that I have of encountering serious conflicts when we begin to talk about racism, when Israel comes up and accusations are made that Israel is a racist country. What should we do? What should we respond? How do we respond to something like that? I know that some of us have right-wing politics and others of us have left-wing politics, but how should a discussion like that take place? What would you suggest? Either of you want to take that on? Yeah.
Rabbi, go ahead, please.
Sure. I love Israel. And the only place that I've really experienced racism, like called a nigger to my face, was in Israel. So I understand that there is a race problem, that there is a racial problem in Israel. There's a racial problem in America. So I don't shy away from the conversation, because just like I love America and stand up and say that this is wrong, I love Israel and I'm able to stand up and say this is wrong. And so I would go back to, of course, the questions of what is the experience of people of color in Israel, right? Because unless we're actually doing that research and asking those questions, then everything else is just our assumptions. And we're assuming that, because I don't know who I is, but I'm not a racist, therefore Israel can't be racist, Jews can't be racist, we're a minority, right? All of these things that we tell ourselves that aren't playing out in reality. So certainly asking those questions of brown Jews, of people, of African refugees in Israel. I experienced a lot of that also when I spent time in Tel Aviv and asked those questions to understand what their experiences were like, or Ethiopian Jews in Jerusalem to hear what their experiences were like. Because while we operate in different worlds, racism is the same in everywhere we go. And we need to be asking those questions and hearing those voices as well.
Thank you. Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I'll add. So for your viewing at home on your subscription, TV, Berkeley in the 60's, an Academy Award nominated documentary. It came out some years ago. There's one particular scene when the free speech movement activists are in Sproul Hall, on the Berkeley campus, and they're doing a sit-in, and there's 1,000 students sitting. And then in the middle of the sit-in, someone brings in a record player and plays Tzena Tzena, the Israeli song, and 50 students jump up to their feet and start engaged in Israeli folk dancing in the middle of Sproul Hall, in the middle of free speech movement on the Berkeley campus. And I'm near the Berkeley campus now. And so I always, can you imagine today on the Berkeley campus, Israeli folk dancing in the middle of a leftist rally? So really for me, that's the snapshot of historically what's happened. From Israel's creation until the mid-60s, it was a socialist utopia. The kibbutz and moshav movements were really for the leftist world to see how you could create this kind of system on a national scale. With the rise of the New Left and the rise of Black Power, there was a flip in the mid-60s. Now, Israel went from being a socialist leftist utopia to being a colonial imperialist oppressor. And now the Israeli military and Israeli police became the equivalents of the white Southern sheriffs with the water cannons in the civil rights movement. And this was such a hard switch for American Jews to watch and see, because it turned it all upside down. For progressive Zionists, right, even those in Berkeley, when all this was going down, they had to sort of decide, are they going to become an anti-Zionist Jew? Or are they going to be a progressive Zionist that will fight for the equality of all peoples, Israeli, Jewish, Muslim, Palestinian, Christian, just name the category. So the question I ask, because I'm at San Francisco State and we're one of the nation's leading anti-Zionist universities, so this takes up a lot of my time. I note that the definition of Zionism is often flattened, that the way one can get to colonial imperialist is if one misses a whole lot of else of what's going on. So our undergraduates first will work education to see how much they know. And my question is there such thing as a progressive Zionist? Meaning, can one believe in Jewish nationalism and also respect the humanity of everybody involved in some way, right? Can we hold all that together simultaneously? If the answer is yes, we're good, right? If the answer is no, right, that's where I think we're getting into the tension and the conflict, because that becomes a rejectionist approach. And if there's no answer to give, there's no place to go with that.
Yeah, I agree. I'll tell you, I'm also increasingly losing patience with the attacks on Israel that seem to be blind to the same problems that exist around the world, and also seem to be blind to a goal, a solution. So Israel is called settler colonialism, but so is the United States. So what are we all going to do? Should we go to Mars? I just find it, I'm tired of it. And I'm also worried that we're not paying attention to the impact of certain arguments in terms of giving fodder to alt-right movements and white supremacists. So that worries me too. Let me just tell you, we're going to start taking some questions from the audience, and I think we have quite a few in just a moment. I hope that both of you, I have a sense that both of you are somewhat optimistic. I have that feeling that you're both upbeat. Am I right? And yes. And I also hope that we can learn just briefly from you in our last minute, something about how Jews can talk to other Jews about racism. Because I don't know about you, but I do often encounter sometimes at the Shabbat dinner table at somebody's home, someone will make a racist comment, or in the course of a discussion with some students. What do you do in those situations, Tiferet?
Yeah, and I should say, I feel like I have to be optimistic because I have a child, a young child. So I have to be hopeful and still work very hard to make that positive world come to fruition. I just want to share a little bit that my teacher and student of your father, Rabbi Dr. Arthur Green, wrote for Passover a few years ago. And since Passover is coming up very shortly, and we'll be on around the virtual table with our families, he wrote this piece that was very powerful, and I hold on to this very often, not just Passover. But he writes, "Let us remember what a fortunate Jewish generation we are. We live in a very rare moment of history when nowhere in the world are Jews being oppressed by the state for the crime of being Jews or living out their Judaism. We have the great luxury in our day of not having to see this story through the eyes of a still oppressed people. Yes, there are still anti-Semites in the world, and vigilance remains appropriate. But nowhere do they govern over Jews or tell them what they may or may not do. Indeed, we Jews are undeniably a force in the power establishment that rules over others, both by our relatively high status economically, educationally, etc., in Western countries, especially the United States and in the state of Israel. This forces us to ask whether we may have switched roles in the Passover story. Could our enslavement be that of being stuck in the role of oppressor?" And so for me, just again, asking that question, who are we in the Passover story now? And in listening to his words and replacing Jewish with Black, we can't say that we live in a rare moment of history when Black people are not being oppressed by the state for the crime of being Blacks or living their lives just as Black people. That's exactly what's going on, right? We see people getting shot just for going for a jog, for buying Skittles, for just existing, right? We have, there are, oops, sorry, I lost my other thought.
That's okay.
We're not a force, right? People of color are not in expansive power in this country, but white Jews are. So how do we see our power, our as Jewish power and privilege, and use it? And I think not denying it, but finding out how to use it is key for the people who aren't in power. And that's the story of the Exodus, right? And that's what I think Rabbi Green is pushing us to say. Are we Pharaoh that we need to figure out how to transform our power, or are we still Avadim Hayinu? Are we still those who are not in power?
Yes, and to some extent, we are both, and we have to recognize that. I just taught an article by the historian Natalie Z. Davis about Jewish-owned slave plantations in Suriname, and what these Jews were saying on Passover when reading their Haggadah and talking about being liberated from slavery when they owned thousands of slaves on their plantation. So yes, there's some of both, and that's historically how it's been. In turning to some of the questions from our audience, Marc, one of the questions is asking about your book and the question of white supremacy, which is something that you have introduced in the new second edition, but you didn't discuss, I think, in the first edition, or perhaps you did, but that's the question. How might it have been different if that had been an issue in the first edition of your book?
Thank you, and I'll expand the question because I've done so much learning in the last few years, in the latter stages of the book, and certainly since the book came out. I wrote this book because I was interested in the Jewish ethnic and religious revival of the 70s. I started the research in the 70s and then moved back and discovered Black power, as a causal agent, and then went back to the 50s, in order to see it there. So I published what I thought was a book about why Jews became more Jewish in the 70s. I was actually not looking at it through a racial equity lens. And through a conversation I had in the latter stages of the book with Ilana Kaufman, who is now the founder and executive director of Jews of Color Initiative, she called out how much, racial equity issues were really in the book, even though I didn't say so out loud. So the epilogue is actually the deconstruction of the lunch we had together and her calling that out. And then in the last few years, of course, I'm learning a whole lot more about white racial privilege and white supremacy and the way that system has benefits. So when the book was about to go into its fourth printing, I was asked to sort of reflect on the themes of the book against what's going on in America. And then for the first time, I use the words because I've learned a lot more about the fact, and here's where it comes in with the thesis of the book. Back in the 50s and 60s, most white Jewish liberals defined a racist as someone who liked the KKK or supported Jim Crow. And since I don't support the KKK and I'm against Jim Crow, I'm good and I'm not a racist. And of course, what we're learning today is that one needs to be an anti-racist, which means benefiting from and sitting in a system of white supremacy in and of itself is perpetuating and creating the inequality. Therefore, we can't look back at that photograph, of your dad and Dr. King and sit down, right? We have to stand up and recognize. And I'll just close by saying it's a challenging vocabulary for a lot of white Jews, because white supremacy is a system by which white people get to be supreme, in education and healthcare and policing. White supremacist is a neo-Nazi that wants to kill Jews. So to say Jews benefit from white supremacy is not to say that Jews are neo-Nazis. And we must also recognize that if we are going to deal with this as it really exists, we're going to have to recognize that living with the privilege in the system of white supremacy demands then that we actually take action.
Yes, we have a several strong questions about Israel and about students at college campuses who can be rather heatedly attacked by other students for their own support of Israel. And someone mentioned that Marc Hill from Temple University said earlier this week or recently that Black Lives Matter seeks to dismantle the Zionist project. How should we respond to statements like that or such comments? Many of us may be critical of some aspect of the Israeli government. I'm critical of just about every government in the world. But those kinds of statements I find chilling. Do we ignore them? Do we respond? What should we do? What should we advise our students? We don't have, by the way, we don't have that at Dartmouth College where I teach. We don't have an anti-Israel program going on in any way, and never have for whatever reason. So I don't think it's ubiquitous, but would either of you like to say something about that? Or perhaps actually...
I'll take a different approach. I don't know that quote. I haven't read it, so I haven't studied it, but I get this basic question all the time. Black Lives Matter is a hashtag. It's a slogan, but mostly it's a statement of humanity. Black lives matter. And how about the idea that that's the beginning and the end of it? Because once one believes in the humanity of Black lives and that they matter, then that's what we're working for. That's the point, right? I am sure there's going to be an activist in the Black Lives Matter movement who is going to be anti-Israel, and I'm sure there's another who's going to be anti-Zionist, and there's got to be some anti-Semites too. And I got to believe there's going to be some racists in the Jewish community, and we got white Jewish anti-Zionists, right? And once we mix it all up, then we're able to see complexity and even confusion across people, across groups, and across identity markers. And if we could just take a pause and a deep breath and understand that if we're fighting for racial equity, let's do it. And if you're sitting side by side in the fight and that person says something against the Jewish people's right to self-determination, that's a perfect moment to have that conversation. I am more worried about group status statements that it's going to link all of Black Lives Matter or all of Black people or all of Jewish people, like whatever you want to do it, than I am about whatever the critique is. Because I often find sometimes that those get elevated in order to sort of provoke, and then it kind of takes us away from the work of seeing humanity in one another.
Thank you. That's helpful. And I have to say that in my courses on modern Jewish history at Dartmouth, I have students from all over the world, from China, Pakistan, Vienna, everywhere, Jewish, not Jewish, but they come to understand and say it quite clearly. They understand why Zionism and why it's important. and I appreciate that. So I actually think a good discussion with people is the best response. And Tiferet, what I think is also great is that TBZ has, I believe, declared itself as an anti-racist synagogue, an anti-racist community. And that's great. And I think that we should all strive for that, all synagogues and all communities. And I wonder if you might say a word about how TBZ understands that, its mission.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. One of the things that I start with is that TBZ was on the path to becoming establishing itself as an anti-racist synagogue before I arrived. Right. So it's not because I'm there. It's because the people who go there recognize that our fates are tied up together, and, that a pillar of white supremacy is anti-Semitism. And as Professor Dollinger said, Black Lives Matter is a statement, right? So like all of that led to what's now our racial justice working group. And what TBZ is doing is taking a three-pronged approach. Because we're all coming at this work from very different places, and that's okay, right? Back to the non-judgmental, that's okay. So there's the self-track of racism is new to me. I have recently become aware that I live in a white supremacist system, or a system of white supremacy. I always think about it like the Matrix, like I just woke up. And so then we offer book groups and movies and conversations and those things to continue to clarify what this system of white supremacy is and how deeply entrenched we are in it, all of us. And then there are people who are dedicated to making TBZ itself an anti-racist organization, from the top down and bottom up. So looking at the board, looking at our mission statement, looking at our purchasing choices, looking at what we support, what we stand up for, and how our voice is used in the community. And then there's the third level, which is using TBZ's platform as a voice in the greater community, even beyond the Jewish community, in the world. And how do we work to dismantle racism in the world? So, we're working on one of our members, Jonathan Klein, is driving fair housing in Brookline, right? Where our synagogue is in Brookline. And that's, thinking about like, what is something that we can do? Many synagogues are in places where there isn't a lot of affordable housing. So asking those questions and figuring out how can we diversify our communities? We are working with GBIO, the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, and looking at issues that may not seem on their surface to be racist or have to do with race, but very much do. Gun control, healthcare, all of these things have to do with racism in our society. So working on those legislative issues to dismantle this white supremacy and this racist system.
That's great. Thanks. That's inspiring for all of us. And I want to take just the last few questions and try to put them together like this. And that is, quite a few people have commented on what happened January 6th and the rise of white nationalism and neo-Nazis in this country over the course of some years. And the question is, first of all, what can we do as Jewish organizations to forge an alliance? Because these are groups that are attacking Black people, Native people, Jewish people, Asian, and so on. Maybe we need to reconfigure some of our Jewish organizations or have alliances of Jewish organizations and others. What do you think? And in connection with that, I just want to say that I thought that the ADL issued a very strong and important statement after January 6th, when I was very upset, and I read it and it really touched my heart to hear such a strong, clear statement from the ADL regarding that horror. But part of this question, I guess, to you, Marc, would be, is there anything we can learn in terms of what we need to do today from the way things might have been handled a bit differently in the late 60s by Jewish organizations, late 60s, early 70s? Did we make mistakes? Can we learn from that experience? What do you think?
I'm sure we made mistakes. I'm sure we could learn from it, and that's okay. The Saturday night after the 2016 election, Saturday Night Live had one of the most poignant sketches I have ever seen. When everyone thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, Donald Trump won, and all those white cast members are watching hour by hour, getting more and more disbelieved over what they're seeing. And two of the black comedians, I think Chris Rock was a guest host that night, they're in the back going, they're totally unfazed by all of it because they don't see any shock or surprise. And of course, this was 3 days after the election, and now that we're 4 years plus, and we see what happened on January 6th, I think that, and I'll speak now as an academic historian, let's name it, as you said, giving ADL credit for actually naming what happened on January 6th. And second, let's let go of exceptionalism. The notion among so many of us, I'll include myself in white liberal America, who have this idea that American democracy is different and better than any other place because we're different and better. And the truth is we're not. We're not exceptional. We're struggling. And what we've seen now in recent times with racism and anti-Semitism is actually what's been around for centuries. And now it's been given more platform, and maybe more for this conversation we're having tonight. The more painful part is to let go of American Jewish exceptionalism, because I think so much of our memory of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s is rooted in the idea that white Jews were different and better than white Christians or anyone else. And therefore, we know the answer, and we're going to first give it to the blacks in the 50s and 60s, and now we're going to tell everybody what it is. And I think we're all getting hit with a lot of humility, which I think is a really good, healthy thing. It's hard to let go of constructed memory and to imagine that the world is different than we thought, and probably has been different in the past than we thought it was. And I think to be rabbinic a moment, Rabbi, that's where the redemption hopefully will end up coming from.
Yeah, I hope so too. I think though that, on the one hand, that Selma March that my father participated in was a great moment of celebration for the Voting Rights Act. And yet that Voting Rights Act has been eviscerated by state legislatures and even by the Supreme Court. So holding up that picture really does need to be a challenge. And at the same time, I think we should also be grateful for what the civil rights movement gave to us as Jews. When my father was alive, synagogues didn't have a declaration of being an anti-racist community. They didn't have social activism in synagogues. That was seen as something that didn't belong in the synagogue. And this has really changed. I think the civil rights movement also gave us Jewish feminism, and I'm grateful for that. I think also gave us Jewish studies because of Black studies, but it also gave us ideals. And I think it made us proud of being Jewish because of Dr. King elevating the Hebrew Bible, the Exodus, and the prophets to such a wonderful degree. And I think for so many of the refugees, including refugee rabbis who came from Nazi Europe, where Christian theologians said that the Old Testament didn't belong in the Bible in Nazi Germany. They threw it out of the Bible. And to come to this country and the respect for the Hebrew Bible, for the prophets, from Dr. King and from the whole civil rights movement, that I think helped restore our souls after what we went through in the Second World War. So, and the friendship also is a sign of what can be accomplished, of the kinds of friendships that can be forged. My father and Dr. King came from such different backgrounds, and yet they met and they became so close. And I think it was the Bible that actually brought them together. So there is, finally, since Tiferet, you brought up the Passover coming, which is coming pretty soon. So we have to start cleaning out our cabinets in our homes. But Passover in 1968, my father had invited Dr. and Mrs. King and their children to come to our Passover Seder. And unfortunately, Dr. King was assassinated just shortly before Passover. But I guess I would just leave all of us with the thought, what if Dr. King and Mrs. King and their children came to your Passover Seder? What would you talk about? What would you present from Judaism? How would you express Jewish gratitude to the civil rights movement? And what would you say Judaism has to offer today to the anti-racism work? I want to thank the Vilna Shul and the AGL, Marc Dollinger and Tiferet Berenbaum. I want to thank all of you for attending. There is in the chat a link to a survey that you can fill out and write about how you experience this program. I'm sure you can also contact all of us. And also I'll invite you to contact the ADL and Robert Treston here at the Boston office and be in touch and raise your questions if we didn't get to all of them tonight. I just wondered, Tiferet, if you'd like to say a last concluding word for our evening and give us a word of hope.
Sure, thank you. So TBZ, we are engaging in this middle process, like I mentioned, and contracting with a diversity consultant. And it's going to take time. And the fact that so many people are having these conversations now, that people are asking more questions, that we're slowly becoming okay with these processes taking time, signals to me that we're really ready to do the work. Right? Before it was, this is the problem, here's the solution. This is the problem, here's the solution. And it's never been that simple. It's always been deeply complex, and we've been navigating intersectionality before we had the word to call it that. So now that we're taking the time to slow down, I believe we're all going to be able to take much more intentional steps. And that's what gives me hope, that we're able to bring ourselves and our intentions to this work.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Marc and Tiferet and Vilna Shul and AGL. And good night, everybody. Have a good week. Take a little bit of Shabbat spirit with you from our discussion tonight. Good night, everyone. Bye. Bye.